one of the greatest discoveries in the history of medicine, a discovery whose benefits and whose truth still stands to this day. This discovery was made over 160 years ago by a man named Ignez Semmelweis. The discovery itself is pure brilliance. B, the process of the discovery is one of the most fascinating stories of all time. I got turned on to the subject through reading this book, Plague of Corruption, by Judy Mikovits, in the foreword written by Robert F. Kennedy. And by the way, if you haven't already seen it, I already have an hour video on that subject, on Mikovits and her video on her conspiracy theory and everything else. But in the foreword written by Kennedy, he mentioned something called the Semmelweis reflex. What is the Semmelweis reflex? Basically, when somebody comes up with a new theory that challenges the existing established paradigm, or the medical establishment, the media, what people at the time believe, and where the money is and where the politics are, there is a reflex whereby everybody rejects it, ridicules the guy, and basically throws out the theory. It's named after Semmelweis because that's what happened to him. He discovered the reason why many hundreds and thousands of moms, healthy moms giving birth, were dying in hospitals. This was in the 19th century. It was extremely dangerous to give birth in a hospital. He discovered A, why it was happening. B, he discovered the cure, how to fix it. But C, nobody would listen to him, and his ideas were rejected throughout the duration of his lifetime, even though he demonstrated in writing what it was that was happening and how to fix it. And it was like as clear as day, yet it was rejected. Now, for Kennedy, the tradition of being a Semmelweis, or this tradition of having to face the Semmelweis reflex, is now inherited in modern day terms by Judy Mikovits, where she comes up with this, what he thinks is a grand theory of why the whole COVID thing is a big conspiracy, and why everybody was against her and persecuted her, and it was all so that everybody could protect their own positions or whatever it may be. Hence, she's this truth teller. She's like Semmelweis, and the entire medical and media and governmental establishment is out to get her. So what I want to really do today is I want to show you the real story of Semmelweis. I want to bring it to you in its historical context. I want to show you the development of his ideas. I also want to bring to you the grandeur of his actual discovery, what it means for us today, what it meant at the time. And finally, in so doing, I want to be able to, for everyone to understand the difference between a Semmelweis and a Mikovits, how to figure out when a person who's just being persecuted is the real deal, is the truth teller, is the person that we're going to celebrate for the next few hundreds of years, or when the person's simply an imposter who deserves to be rejected. And the only way to do it is to look into the details. The devil is in the details. So the only way to figure out that story with Mikovits is to read her research, understand it, and see if it makes logical sense. And that's what I did in the last video. Today I want to apply the same process, the same procedure, into looking at Semmelweis's work. And so, first of all, in order to do it, I've purchased and read no fewer than 10 books. Most of these I've read twice. Starting with his own book, which was written published around 1860. Still readable. It's actually quite awesome. It's still, what's so awesome about his work is that you could still follow the logical trajectory, and it's simplicity, and it makes you wonder how anybody could read this and not listen to him, because it's just so purely logical and simple, yet it didn't work. Not only was his work rejected, but he was tricked by his own colleagues into being forced to an insane asylum. So they had him institutionalized against his will, and he died under those circumstances at a very young age, in his 40s. Really as a result of his work and of the non-reception of his theories and his discovery by the medical establishment. So let's start with his life. This guy Semmelweis was born in Budapest in Hungary in 1818, and he ended up going to medical school. He decided to go to, and he went, and of course he went to the best medical school at the time, would have been at the University of Vienna. So he graduated medical school in 1844, graduates medical school, and he decides that he wants to go into OB, just like going into a specialization today. So at first he was rejected. He ended up getting this position as an aspirant So he was like an aspiring resident. And during that time, and he didn't have the same responsibilities as the resident. He had a lot of time studying in the autopsy rooms and trying to learn from who we know today as one of the greatest pathologists of all times, Karl Rokitansky. So this brings me to a little bit of a side point. At the University of Vienna, during this particular time, there was a revolution in medicine that was in the middle of happening while he was there. And Rokitansky was instrumental in this revolution. You need to understand what medicine was before the 19th century. We talk about medicine, modern medicine, I should say scientific medicine didn't exist until 100, 200 years ago. So relatively speaking, it's an infant. Before the 1800s, medicine was almost completely speculative. It was almost like a mystical endeavor. There were three theories that were based from the time of Hippocrates, from the time of the Greek thinkers. But these theories, which tended to be holistic, focused on a whole variety of factors that they felt could be involved in disease. So, for instance, if somebody was feeling ill, the first thing they would try to figure out is maybe it has something to do with the climate. Where is the guy from? What kind of skin does he have? What kind of temper does he have? What's his temperament like? Hot-blooded, cold-blooded, what has he been eating? Where's the moon today? All these types of factors. What country is he from? What part of the world is he from? How far from the equator is he? And then try to tie this into when he was born and what constellation of stars is out. And they were theories that involved all these things. And it would take someone with extreme brilliance to figure out all these theories. But the bottom line is that their idea of cause and effect was so far from what we consider today. It's so different. It was also based on humoral theory, what your balance of humors was. They believed that the body was made of 4 humors or substances, like blood and bile. So for instance, you had too much of this, we had to get rid of that. So that's why they would always bleed people. They would purge people. Common treatments was to someone has a problem, take some blood out. He has too much blood. So doctors did a lot of damage. The term doctor for me didn't exist past 150 years ago. The guy past that was a different entity. You can't compare the two positions as a profession. Comes the 19th century, and this is in line, medicine actually trailed the scientific revolution. So the scientific revolution was the trend of thought that said, from now on, when we build a theory, it's going to be on things that I could observe. If I can't see it, touch it, smell it, I'm not going to count it. And we're going to start from the ground up, and we're going to call that science, the things that we can measure, record, compare, using our own eyes, using our sense perceptions. So the days of these speculative theories of feelings and spiritualism and all these words that people nowadays like to use, if you go back 200 years ago, those are the words that were killing people. Now, in the University of Vienna in the 19th century, the first step towards moving into a science was looking at autopsies, because that's when people started to pass away. They would look and they would see, this is too big, that's too small. They were taking measurements, looking at the colors, looking at the smells. They would take notes, record it, and then they could compare the things that they found relative to how the guy died while he was still alive. And they started to note it, and their whole conception of even classifying diseases changed. It used to be, before this revolution, that a disease was classified based on a symptom. So somebody would come in and say stomach ache, that goes in the stomach ache basket. And it could be, now stomach ache could be caused by a whole lot of things. We know today that stomach ache, is just one clue that should lead us to looking for the cause. Then stomach ache, that was the end game. And that's why, and because their classifications were so off, they had no chance of being able to treat. And they also had no chance of being able to track what treatments worked or didn't work, because they were treating a whole wastebasket of stuff under their categories. Now, with this revolution, things were being classified by physical findings. Now, if you could only classify something after the person is dead, that's not going to be very useful. But that was only one step. The next step was utilizing the physical examination. So here, one of the most famous people at this was a guy named Joseph Skoda. He was a doctor at the University of Vienna, and he specialized in taking objective measurements. So he was especially auscultating, listening. Today we think of the stethoscope as being associated with the doctor. This was the man of the stethoscope. He would listen to the heart. He listened to so many hearts, he knew what all the sounds meant. And after every single patient passed away, he would look at what the heart looked like after they were dead. And he started saying, when I hear this, it ended up looking like that, and the guy ended up dying like such. And now you're getting a classification of diseases based on the physical exam and pathology, which is what I am. I'm a pathologist. So Karl Rokitansky, that name, the pathologist at the University of Vienna, he's one of our greatest pathologists of all time. This is where he fits in. He did upwards of 30,000 autopsies, whereas I did about 60 autopsies. He did 30,000, and he was instrumental in describing and reclassifying diseases based on findings. Skoda, the person who was walking around, who was listening, he was also known for tapping. So he could tap out different sounds on the body and tell how big a person's liver was it too expanded? He could tell if someone had pneumonia, because the lungs usually should be air-filled, very tympanic, like a drum. If it has pneumonia, it's consolidated, it's hard, you won't get the same tapping sound. And he would compare the sounds with what he saw. At the time, everyone thought he was ridiculous. They thought this guy was out of his mind, tapping patients like a nuthead. In reality, he was on the money. His findings were solid, they were measurable, they were repeatable. Here is where you have medicine being turned into science. Again, this is pretty late because the scientific revolution is already happening in chemistry and physics and other things. So medicine is really lagging behind. One of the things they made fun of Skoda about was because they called him too materialistic, because everything has to be physical, you have to feel everything. But like I said, before him, medicine was considered more of a spiritualistic, more of a holistic, more of a naturalistic. Those were the words that would describe a doctor. Before Skoda and Rokitansky, figuring out diseases were considered incomprehensible to a human. Only God could really get to the bottom of why that particular person has a disease. We can only, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelmingly complicated. They could never figure anything out, but they could only try. So they would put leeches and take blood and purge. And it's no wonder that doctors did a ton of damage before this revolution. Semmelweis walks into medical school at the University of Vienna in the midst of this revolution. So he's walking in, and Karl Rokitansky is his teacher. Joseph Skoda is his mentor. These were the people that he was learning from. There was a major competition going on at the University of Vienna over this revolution, because the establishment, the conservatives in the hospital were against it. They thought and imagine, they went to medical school, they were forced to memorize thousands and thousands of aphorisms, of sayings, of things like an apple a day keeps the doctor away. They had to memorize just rote traditions and statements. And now you have some punk coming in and saying, hey, we're not doing that anymore, we're going to do it like this. So they were reluctant to change. And it was not only about that, there was also political upheaval at the time in Austria. The government was a monarchy. It was ruled by the Habsburgs, and they directly controlled who would be in charge of different departments in the hospital. So the universities didn't have freedom of expression and freedom of academia and freedom to, they were being puppeteered by this autocratic government, which also ruled over Hungary. So naturally, guys like Skoda, Rokitansky, and Semmelweis wanted their freedom. They were like even political revolutionaries. Whereas the people who didn't want to change so much were considered conservatives. They wanted to keep things the same. So there was also political animus between the revolutionary doctors and the conservative, old school, keep it the same, stop hassling me doctors. All right? Semmelweis, he's brand spanking new out of medical school. He's now an aspirant, resident for OB. And he walks in, and the first thing that slaps him in the face is that women are dying at a crazy rate. Let me put some numbers on this. Somewhere between 10 to 20, even up to 30% of healthy women who came to give birth to a child died. It's outrageous. This was not only happening at the University of Vienna, this was happening all over Europe. It was happening in Britain, it was happening in Germany, it was happening in France. So at some of the best hospitals on earth, University of Vienna being one of the best hospitals on earth, one of the largest hospitals on earth, women were dying left and right, and this was called childbed fever, also called puerperal fever. Woman gives birth, gets a fever, Nothing anybody can do about it. No one knows what it's from. Dead. Okay? So the theory at the time, part of what I just said, was that this was considered part of an epidemic or a miasma. It was like there was a disease in the air and women are dying. The air is no good. Or they would compare it to an epidemic of a disease that sweeps in and just starts killing people without explanation. Even though it wasn't even associated with any seasons, it wasn't seasonal. They had no idea what to do or how to control it. They figured it was multifactorial. Like it has to do with A, the constitution of the woman, and B, where they were, and C, again, had to do with a whole bunch of factors, all of which would have been out of your control. And therefore, it's not your fault that they're dying because there's nothing you can do about it, which is very convenient as a matter of fact. So no one's responsible for it. The explanations that they had for the disease didn't explain anything, really. All it did was remove any blame from them. What's so special about Semmelweis is that he didn't buy it. From the get-go, it didn't make sense to him. And a big part of that was because he had 2 years before he even started his real residency to hang out with guys like Rokitansky and Skoda and see how they were thinking and be influenced by them. The first thing he did was that he read everything he could about every theory that existed in the world about what childbed fever is and what causes it. So he knew what people were writing in his area. He knew what people were writing in Britain. He was well versed in the literature. The second thing he did, because the University of Vienna had tons of records, he went through the records in detail. He went over every year how many people died, what month they died, what beds the people were in that would die. He made tables and charted out. It must have been extremely tedious, and you could see his tables. They're just it's the same type of data we have. It's just tables and tables of data, just tabulating it. The other thing he did was he went and studied philosophy, specifically the philosophy of logic with Joseph Skoda. So Joseph Skoda, the person I mentioned to you before, he had, his other interests, his interest in how to think and how to find the truth influenced him as a doctor, and that ended up influencing Semmelweis in that way. So he studied logic. And the other thing he did was he got involved, he had permission from Rokitansky and got involved in every single autopsy he could that had to do with childbed fever. So this guy did his homework. The autopsy findings at first weren't so obvious what their meaning was. As opposed to some diseases where you have, like, for instance, if you have a tumor, you locate a tumor, it has a definite location, you can measure it, there's a tumor. Here, the findings varied somewhat, and they were also in different areas. It didn't just affect the woman's gynecological tract. Things that he did notice was that they tended to have fluid accumulation, specifically pus, within the abdominal cavity, within the thoracic cavity, within the pleural, so what we call pleural effusion, pleuritis, pericarditis, meningitis. So these are all a person's membranes or body cavities. I don't want to go into too much anatomical depth. And also, they would develop abscesses in different areas, almost like metastatic spreading abscesses that would develop in different areas. So this wasn't a localized process that you could say, aha, it's the ovary. It wasn't the ovary. It was sort of a more generalized process. And also, they noticed some changes within the blood that it wasn't clear exactly what it meant. Next, what did he find looking at the archival material? Vienna General Hospital, when it was built in the 18th century, it was built to really help everybody for free. Anybody who couldn't otherwise afford care, and women who had to give birth, the hospital was open to all. They would come in and they would even get to stay for a few months. So it's a very different experience than what we have now. But here's the catch. It's free with the understanding that all the doctors in training get to practice on you. So you had to understand that you're there, they're giving you the service of treating you, but your service to the hospital and to society is that they get to learn from you, which is why for every woman that went to the hospital to give birth, all the students that were there, and sometimes there were tens of students, were all doing gynecological examinations, and also it was also understood that if you died, your body was going to be an autopsy, so for learning purposes. Now, the original head of obstetrics at the University of Vienna is a guy named Bohr, B-O-E-R. His philosophy, which he adopted from England, was one of let everything go, don't get involved in the pregnancy. So to do as little manipulation as possible, less is more. So he didn't use forceps. He also was against doing autopsies. So he didn't get his hands dirty with autopsies. He he preferred to teach his students using a mannequin. And during his reign, which was from the late 18th century all the way to about 1820s, the rate of childbed fever was about 1%. Then in around 1822, the establishment told him, you need to start using the bodies and teaching via autopsy, and he refused. So they threw him out, even though he was doing an outstanding job. And they stuck in this guy, Klein. And Klein steps in, and right away, the percentage of childbed fever, of mortality in the hospital goes up to 7%. And across Europe around this time, it's probably around 10 to 15%. And from 1822 through to the 1840s, it hovers from 5%, 7%, 10%. That became the new norm. Meanwhile, the other guy had it for 20, 30 years at 1%. That's the first thing he notices. The second thing, around 1839, 1840, the hospital was growing. They divided the OB department into two divisions, Division 1, Division 2. And Division 2 constantly killed 3 to 4 to 5 times more people than Division 1. And there was no explanation, there was no attempted explanation. And it was consistent over years. So from 1840 to about 1846, Semmelweis just tabulated data. You could look at it at a table, it's like, just 3 times, 4 times more, just dying. So the question, once that's established, the question is, what's the difference between Division 1 and Division 2? So here it is. Division 1 admitted patients on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and Division 2 admitted patients on Sunday, Tuesdays. So is it possible that that Mondays versus Tuesdays that would seem ridiculous? In essence, what you had here was the first accidental clinical trial, where you have just by the way the thing was set up, you have a control group, you have one group that's doing okay, and you have one group where people are dying at a faster rate, and now it's incumbent on you to figure out what the difference is. Semmelweis writes in his book that it was so obvious that the death rate was different that the patients would beg and scream not to go to Division 1. A lot of people would purposely give birth in the street and pretend they were on the way to the hospital, because there was a thing, if you're on the way to the hospital, we'll take care of you as though you gave birth in the hospital, which means they took care of the child, and you got to stay in the hospital a few days. They would rather give birth in the street than give birth in that hospital. That's how ridiculous it was. And the doctors are moving on like that's not a problem, which is insane in itself. Their take on it was that women who are pregnant have something within their own constitution, because they're pregnant, that makes them weak, and because of whatever's in the air, in the air right now in Vienna, there's nothing we can do about it. There's a bad air, there's a bad something going on. Another term they used was cosmic, atmospheric, telluric. Like there are cosmic forces out there that we can't control, and therefore there's nothing we can do about it. By the way, the rate of childbed fever in the street was about 1%. Right? So you had to come to the hospital specifically to die. Women with very prolonged labors had a greater chance of dying. Women who gave birth prematurely had a better chance of living, which is kind of funky. So a lot of things were backwards. Out of hospital is healthier than in hospital. Preemies were better. Now, the next step came with his study of formal logic with Skoda. The logical proof is called modus tollens, like from 10th grade math, like truth tables. That's when I talk about formal logic, that's where we actually tabulate if this, then that, but that's not true, therefore this has to be false. So for example, if overcrowding causes childbed fever, then Division 1 should be more crowded than Division 2, but it's the opposite. All the people are running to get into Division 2 is packed. You can't get into Division 2. Therefore, that cannot be true. Cross it off the list. So he was going down the list. And from the things he was crossing off, it just goes to show you how ridiculous some of the theories were. So one thing people said is, the reason why this is happening is because these women are actually poor quality, poor women off the street. But okay, that doesn't make sense. The women are the same women going to one versus the other. That can't be true. Another one would be that the priest who would come to read women their last rites, the route they would take differed from Division 1 and Division 2. In Division 1, he had to walk past all the beds, and there was a guy that would walk in front of the priest ringing the bell. I'm not a Christian, so I don't really understand. They would ring a bell, and he'd freak all the women out, and it was the fear of the bell that would cause them to die in division. So he said, okay, shut off the bell, no bell. Right? Let's see if that solves the problem. It didn't solve the problem? That's not the cause. Maybe it's because in Division 2, they give birth on their sides, and Division 1, they give birth on their back. Okay, turn them all on their sides. Nothing changed. So he went down a list because they had all these things that possible. It could be anything. One of the major things is that he didn't buy that it could be in the air. He said, if this is an epidemic, we're all in the same building. We share the same hallway. It can't be that the air on this side of the hallway is good and the air on that side of the hallway. So he crossed that out. He wouldn't accept that either. Around 1846, he finally gets the position he wanted. He is the chief resident, so to speak, whatever the word was at the time. That's basically his position. Again, he's only a few years out of medical school. He's a kid. Okay, he's now working as the resident in the hospital, and something happened where the previous guy wanted to come back, and the dude that was in charge of the whole OB, which his name was Klein, he said, okay, you're out until this guy gets if that guy wants to come back, you're out. So he threw him out. The guy was all depressed, Semmelweis, really just relaxing. I think he went to Italy. He's taking a trip with his friend, and he's called after a few months. He's called back in. When that guy gets it, he got a different position. Now the spot opened up again. But right before he was about to come back, he heard a tragic story where his other teacher, a guy named Kolechka, he was the forensic pathologist. So this was the guy that was involved in doing autopsies for medical legal reasons at the time. The same way we have our medical examiner today. He was the forensic pathologist, and he was one of the other revolutionary thinkers. So now we could add him to Skoda and to Rokitansky. He also had this guy Kolechka, and Semmelweis liked the guy. He was very disturbed by the fact that the guy died, and he said, how'd the guy die? What happened was he was doing an autopsy, and one of the other residents or students accidentally nicked him with a scalpel. It got infected, he became septic, and he died. They did an autopsy on him, and they saw that they had the same thing. So he had pleural effusions, peritoneal or abdominal cavity effusions. He also had an abscess that even went to he had an abscess in his eye, different abscesses in his body. When Semmelweis heard this, something clicked in his head, and he said, hold on a second. That is that. It's the same item. Now, this is a leap. The reason why it's a leap is because childbed fever was considered specific for pregnant women. Kolechka is not a woman, he's not pregnant. So how could he draw this association? Well, first of all, like I said, this was the prepared mind. He had seen so many autopsies that when he saw the similarities, it clicked for him. He said if that is the finding, and that is the finding, that's a connection. His new philosophy of medicine, which he learned from Rokitansky, clicked for him, which is that we now classify diseases by anatomical findings at autopsy. So this is a new way of thinking about disease altogether. This is not going to make sense to the guy when he tries to explain it to him, is what I'm trying to tell you. He said, if these are the same diseases, they must have the same cause. That is another leap. That's another new way of thinking, which is, I see something in a dead guy, I see something in a dead pregnant woman. If I'm going to call them the same thing, it must be that they're caused by the same thing. And I know what caused it in this guy. He got nicked by the knife. And why did that kill him? This was a known thing already. It was doing these autopsies was risky business. It killed him because what they called cadaveric particles, meaning dead, decaying, putrid bodily stuff from a cadaver infiltrated into a cut. That's enough to kill a person. Okay, you know what? It must be that we're spreading material from cadavers into these women. They said, and now it made sense. What was going on? It turns out that one difference between Division 1 and Division 2 was that Division 1 was where all the medical students were. And Division 2 is where they kept all the midwives. And the midwives weren't obligated to do autopsies. So all the medical students, every day, and especially the ones that were really eager to learn, would go do autopsies. This was before the days that gloves were invented. So these people are doing autopsies with their bare hands, okay? There's no such thing as a germ theory. No one knows anything about bacteria. These concepts didn't even exist. So now you have these kids, and the doctors as well, doing autopsies, barehanded, then they'd go up, and then they would do internal examinations. Not only that, they would all do the examination. So if there were 10 students, it would be 1, 2, 3. And they're doing this in women who are in labor. Women in labor, naturally, because they have the placenta and because of the way the babies take, they naturally have different wounds and lesions that open the bloodstream. So they're literally just transferring infections. He didn't know what an infection was, even though he didn't know, as we use the word with bacteria, but he said, we are directly transferring cadaveric material into these bodies and we're killing people. Now the next step was he said, oh my God, I'm killing people. I'm doing more autopsies than anybody. So that was what's so interesting is you see, and he actually writes about this, how you see in his own thinking how for a minute that overwhelming feeling of having killed people, he has to accept it, he has to come to terms with it. He didn't do it on purpose. Now that I realize it, I have to stop it and we have to fix it. Now they used to only wash their hands, he says, water and soap. I don't know, what kind of soap they had. He says that their hands would smell of the stuff even if they washed. So he knew they weren't cleaning it. So he did a little bit of research and he found out that I think it was in England where they discovered that if you use a chlorine solution, it would get rid of the entire stench and smell, and it would get rid of this cadaveric, any remnants of this cadaveric material. So he went to Klein. Meanwhile, Klein, who replaced the old guy, Bohr, the difference between the two guys is one guy was now doing autopsies on bodies. That's why the thing shot up from 1% to 7%. And that's the beauty of this theory, is its explanatory power. It explains why a woman giving birth in the street is better off than giving birth in the hospital. It explains why a woman who has prolonged labor, which means there's more wound, there's more time for a bacteria. It explains a lot of weird facts. It explains why Division 2 was better than Division 1, even though Division 1 had the medical students and Division 2 had the midwives. So the explanatory power of this one single theory was immense. So he went to Klein and he said, Klein, from now on we have a rule. After you come out for autopsies, before you examine the first patient, you got to wash your hands in this bowl with chlorine. So this is arguably the first time in history. There's some debate, but this is one of the first times of antiseptic treatment being done. And from the time he instituted it, it went straight back down to 1%. And within a short while, Division 1 became better than Division 2. And we know this because he tracked it. So the data is there, it's working. But he was very reluctant to publish or to speak publicly. It just wasn't his thing. So his theory was presented by others, by whether it was Skoda or another guy named von Hebra. He was another revolutionary new thinker. He basically founded modern dermatology. They would push his theories for him. And one of the reasons why miscommunication happened was probably because of that. But over the next few months, he noticed a few hiccups. There was a hiccup where he noticed a whole bunch of people in his division passed away, and he figured out it wasn't from an autopsy. It was because somebody actually had a cancer that was decaying, that they were all touching and then going. So it didn't. He figured out, it doesn't have to be from a cadaver. It could be any type of putrid organic material. So within the year, he basically came down to make a statement that said, from now on, we define childbed fever as the disease caused by decaying putrid organic material that's transferred to an open wound. Now we have the open wound because people are giving birth. That is the one necessary cause in every single case by definition, and therefore this can be cured by cleaning your hands for any putrid material you have, keeping people with this material away from people who are in labor, and we will solve all your problems. Everybody should know about it. Bingo. Case closed. This is like 1847. Now, it's 1847, and right under Klein's nose, because Klein was in charge of the OB, Semmelweis has now demonstrated, he's instituted this new policy of chlorine washing, and he's demonstrated a dramatic improvement in terms of survival for pregnant moms. And by the way, there was also an improvement in the survival of the fetuses, because a lot of times when the moms who would get septic infections, the infection could spread to the fetus via the blood in utero, and then the baby would also be born with the sickness and end up dying also. So that's another proof that this wasn't a disease specific to pregnant women. Rather, it was specific to contamination entering bloodstream of human being, regardless. Over the next year or so, for the first time ever, Division 1 actually had a better survival rate than Division 2. And people took notice of this, especially the revolutionary end of things. And whereas Semmelweis was actually quite shy, he was hesitant to speak or to publish, his supporters, who were his mentors, they were presenting his material on his behalf. So first of all, letters are being sent out, because these are huge headlines. We just figured out a crazy cure. So they're sending letters all across Europe, and Hebra and Skoda are also presenting for him in different meetings. Hebra actually, at this point, it's I think around 1848, he actually publishes that this is the greatest accomplishment since Edward Jenner. Jenner, you should know, is the guy who's credited with basically discovering the vaccine to smallpox, like the first vaccine ever. So he's considered probably the greatest savior of life, the greatest medical invention ever. So there are some who immediately put Semmelweis right on that same level. Now, in a moment, I'm going to describe the reactions he got. One reaction, which is fascinating, and this was the reaction he got from a guy named Dr. Michaelis from Germany, was upon he wrote back and he accepted the theory, but in doing so, he realized how many cases he personally was responsible for killing, just like Semmelweis realized, and he couldn't take it, and he actually committed suicide. And the reason I bring that up is because one reason why a person might deny the truth is because it's too much to handle psychologically. So to handle it and to live with it was incompatible, was incapable of doing it. So Semmelweis was special in that he was able to get over that hump. He was able to admit what he did and confront it and then move past it. Whereas other people either couldn't handle it or they couldn't accept the truth. Now, they decided at the University of Vienna, there was a big vote, and there was a unanimous vote. They wanted to assign a commission specially to investigate, being now that this guy, he claims to have cured this disease. They wanted an official investigation to look into it and confirm it. And there was a big vote, and they all voted unanimously in favor. But here was the glitch came when they decided who was going to be on the official panel, and Klein was left off the panel. Semmelweis, he's just the resident. He has nothing to do with his upper politics. So this was more about Skoda versus Klein. Klein's voted off the panel that was assigned to evaluate Klein's department. So Klein got really pissed off. He went to his political uppers and he kiboshed the whole thing. So there was an opportunity to actually show what was going on in Klein's department, but without Klein there to control it, he said this is not happening. Semmelweis, because of the way Skoda presented his material and handled it for his own political, agenda, Semmelweis is really put between a rock and a hard place, because he's just the guy with this discovery, but this is the discovery that's associated with Skoda and that could potentially make Klein look bad. So now the guy in the power to control whether or not this is going to be furthered by investigation or confirmed, it might be to his own personal benefit for this truth to never get out. When the time came to renew Semmelweis's appointment, because it was only a 2-year commitment, Klein threw him out and he wouldn't renew it. And he basically took some other loser instead, who had nowhere near the skill or talent or anything. Some guy named Karl Braun became his replacement, and Semmelweis is now unemployed. Klein was his employer. Klein didn't like where this was going, so he's out. And the only thing he could do is appeal to Skoda and to Hebra, but they can't do anything about it. They're not in a position to change anything. So he actually reapplied and said, okay, cool. I don't want to even be a resident. I just want to be a lecturer, what they called a docent. And that was rejected. So he appealed to the government and they said, okay, we'll think about it. And he was just, over those couple of years, he was just so frustrated. And so it was really very demeaning to him also. So it was so offensive. He wanted to continue his research and they weren't even going to let him sit in on autopsies anymore, which he was doing as a student. So at that point, he basically picked up without saying a word and left. And this was most scholars on Semmelweis point to this moment as a turning point in his life for the worse, because there's a good possibility that had he stuck it out, he had enough support where something else would have come up, where he would have come through. He just abandoned everybody who was sticking up for him, and he left them high and dry. And after that, the people that want him were happy he left, and the people that had his back were let down, and so he left without any friends. He just picked up and went. Before he left, the last thing he did was that the deputy of the hospital of Vienna realized what his accomplishment was and asked him to speak before the Medical Society of Vienna. And he did, and this was the first time Semmelweis was going to present his own work, and this was where he declared again, not really declared the final version of the theory, which is that every single case of childbed fever, by definition and by necessity, must be caused by some type of cadaveric or decaying organic material, bar none. And that this can be prevented by washing your hands in a chlorine solution. Okay, so he finally speaks out those words by himself in 1850, but he's without a job and he leaves. He ends up going back to Budapest, which is where he came from. Okay, what I wanted to say before is that what's interesting about the spread of his ideas and the reception of those ideas is that if you read these documents very closely, which you could do because there's a record, you basically come down to seeing that almost nobody understood him. The people who presented his ideas, for instance, Skoda, most often presented it as though it was caused by cadaveric material, leaving out the other causes that he ended up finding, slightly altering the theory. This is important because A, the people who said they were for him didn't even understand him, or they thought that cadaveric material, amongst other things, can cause it, or that cadaveric material was the main cause, implying there was another cause. They couldn't wrap their heads around the possibility that there was only one cause. That's a new way of thinking, that the disease is specific to a cause and that the cause necessarily leads to a disease. Some places thought that what he had to say was ridiculous, because if this was all about cadaveric material, some places don't even do an autopsies and people are dying, so they didn't get it. And in some places, particularly in England, the response was, yeah, we knew that already for 100 years. We agree with you, but you're not saying anything new, which is bizarre, and it's a whole other angle. In England, as opposed to the miasma theory or some of the other theories, the atmospheric theory of Vienna, in England, they believed in a contagion. And they believed what they were being told was that childbed fever is contagious. And they said, we knew that already. This is not but there's a difference between contagious. Contagious implies that it's one item that you can get only from another person with that exact same item. So the flu is contagious. If you have the flu, give me the flu. To make the analogy, you could only get childbed fever from another person with childbed fever, and that's not the case. Any cadaver, decaying material from any cadaver can infect another person, because at the end of the day, it's really the bacteria. It's not the presentation of the symptom of the disease. So they didn't understand they didn't understand the theory, but they didn't understand that they didn't understand. So some people said, nothing new here. Some people said, that's preposterous, we don't even do autopsies, you're crazy. Some people said, we love this idea that the main cause is cadaveric material. No, there is no other cause. So he was widely misunderstood, but it's you have to read very carefully to see the subtleties of how he was misunderstood, because it's when you just read these letters, you don't appreciate that at first. The mistake that was involved in this, Klein would have been, and in the presentation, I should say, in the presentation, he gives the years when it went from 1% up to 7%, and it's very obvious that it was the moment Klein walked in the door that things got really bad very quickly. It was in very big embarrassment to Klein, even though he didn't use his name. Klein didn't want him around anymore, so that's how that was his downfall. At the time, around 1848, there's also real political upheaval. There's a revolution modeled on the French Revolution going on in the Austrian Empire. So people were in the streets protesting for their civil rights at this time also. And a point that some scholars make is that times of political upheaval and political unrest and tension are not always conducive to clear thinking, particularly here where the government really does have control of different positions and Klein is politically connected. The politics of what was going on definitely had an effect on how this unfolded. Semmelweis returns to Budapest. He's pretty much a destroyed man. And he takes a job, an unpaid position at a place called the St. Rochus Hospital. And he works his magic again. And what happens over there is, even though for most of the year they don't have autopsies, he finds that their childbed fever over there is being caused by careless surgeons who are walking straight from their surgical wards, handling all types of wound infections, because that's what they had tons to deal with, and then going to do examinations on a bunch of pregnant women, killing them. He fixed it there. A few years later, he took a position he was actually assigned at the University of Pest. It turns out that Budapest used to be Buda and Pest. So Pest, University of Pest, he comes in there and he solves the problem again. So he's at 3 major institutions. He's 3 for 3. It's not, the statistics are unwavering. Here, the problem he faced was even more ridiculous. People were cleaning their hands. He was on top of the surgeons. It turns out that they were cheaping out on laundry. So they were reusing bloody sheets. And he got so frustrated, it was so maddening to him, that the story has that he actually took a bunch of bloody sheets, marched into the director's office and dumped it on his desk and said, "Here, you sleep on these sheets." And so I say this because as the years got on, he became more angrier, more frustrated, more eccentric, more willing to anger and confront other people. So he was building a reputation as someone they didn't want to talk to. He believed that the truth would come out on its own someday. He was at first very passive in terms of spreading his doctrine. He was confident in it. He referred to his doctrine as though it was eternally true. This was eternal truth. So he had no doubt. His mechanism for a few years in terms of persuading the world was to let the truth come out on its own. It wasn't happening, so he was going crazy. Over 10 years after he had discovered this, it was not accepted anywhere. 10 years, people are just dying. And so in about 1858, 1859, he comes out of his cocoon and he starts writing letters. And the letters have a little bit of an angry tone, and here he is. He's like, "Guys, once and for all, I'm putting this down. Now we have 3 different places where I'm at. I got all the data. Here's the results." Okay, still not going through. So 1860, 1861, this is when he sits down and writes his very famous book. And the book, if I had to describe it, is more like a rant. It's a 600-page rant. And the book is followed by a bunch of directed letters that are fierce, that are accusatory. It's basically like, "Dear Dr. and so-so, you're a goddamn murderer. You're killing people. It's on you. Blood's on your hands." So he was, at this point, people are reading his letters like they're just saying, "This guy's nuts. This is unbecoming of a scientist. This is not an academic manner of speaking." From his perspective, you guys are killing people. So it's hard to judge harsh. It's hard to really be a harsh judge upon him. Some scholars say, look, his personal defects allowed for this to happen, but from his perspective, again, it must have been maddening to see people just getting killed. There are testimonials to his character from even before this, that he was actually a pretty cool guy. He was a good guy. He was a personable guy. He cared about people. He was giving of himself. He actually cared about it. He was a good guy. And they broke him down, and he became a frustrated, angry. He aged really quickly, and he started to have more eccentricities. And he started to do some pretty wacky stuff. By pretty wacky, I mean he was acting in a way that would embarrass his wife or in a way that would embarrass his boss. People started to prefer not to have him around. It reached the point where his wife contacted Hebra. So she's in Budapest. She contacts his old friend, teacher Hebra, and she says, "This guy's we have to put him away in an insane asylum." And so she tricked him. The wife tells him, I'm taking you to a spa. He gets on the train with the wife and an uncle. They take the train to Vienna. They get there. Hebra says, "Oh, you're on the way. First, let's hang and say hello. But I want to show you this new facility I have running." Takes him there. They walk into a room. Everyone turns around and bolts, and he gets stuck there. And he tried to escape, on the spot, and he was held down against his will. They beat him, and he died within 2 weeks. I've read different reports as to the cause of death. Some people, the really romantic version of this is that he himself died of childbed fever. He as a result of either the beating or some people say that he had a prior injury from a surgery. He himself became septic and died of the same disease, and he actually was autopsied by Rokitansky in lab in University of Vienna. So the ultimate irony. The circumstances of his death at this place are very suspect. As a result of the fact that his doctrine wasn't accepted, they had to wait until other people like Pasteur and Lister would further germ theory and antisepsis, clean hand washing, to the point that it was accepted. Had the world been ready to receive him, they could have had this information 20 years before they had it. They had it and they disregarded it. So they buried a diamond. Now to conclude, I want to just restate the main crowning achievement of Semmelweis. On a superficial level, Semmelweis was the guy who figured out antisepsis, particularly in people who are either pre-surgical or giving birth, who are susceptible to having something introduced to their bloodstream. But I think much more important than that is the manner of thinking and his approach to attainment of truth that he showed. So he was basically by matter of chance, he was one of the pioneers of a randomized trial. The fact that he was working in two divisions that were in every way identical, using the same facilities, allowed him to get to this point. Today, we have the ability to do that on purpose, but they didn't even know they were trying to do that. A. B. Applying a mathematical statistical model to show scientific data. Again, critical turning point. And then the next thing is using valid logical arguments. It could be important not to be fooled by false or fallacious type of thinking. In terms of his effect on the history of medicine, he was really one of the first to define a disease by a sufficient and necessary cause, and one cause alone. Prior to him and his time, diseases were considered multifactorial, beyond comprehension. And once Semmelweis introduced this new way of thinking, and I showed you just based upon how it was received, people weren't ready to think this way. This is how today we think this way. We take it for granted that we think this way. Now we've seen a reversal. Now here's to conclude. Today, what we see is people arguing against the establishment, the medical establishment, that is, people who want to say whether that vaccines don't work, or that doctors don't work, or that medical school stinks, or that no one knows anything, or that everything's a hoax or a conspiracy, and that and I'm not saying that's not possible. Semmelweis kind of made that argument, but Semmelweis wasn't right because he went against the establishment. He was right because he was right. So sometimes it's sexy to just be anti-establishment, or just be argumentative or reactionary. The lesson of Semmelweis, and this is another thing to learn, to remember that the first example, the original rebel, was scientific medicine. We rebelled against 2,000 years of ignorance. So we should hesitate before we overthrow that and go back to words that are big sounding and nice sounding, but low in meaning. Let the data speak for itself. There's so much data out there, it's very, very difficult for one person to master it all. But it's out there so that if we're not lazy, it's there. Somebody can do it. And I think I'll just end with that.